Hello.
Hello everybody, back in the workshop again this week.
Hello and welcome.
I hope you've had a good week.
Hello and welcome to Turning Point Church. Thank you so much for joining us today.
If you'd like to find out more, please contact us via the website, Instagram or Facebook.
Your life, like my life, is shaped by the decisions we make. Our greatest regrets are connected to decisions that we maybe wish we could go back and unmake. And that's why we're looking at these 4 questions for making better decisions. Today's question is so helpful, particularly for those surprise decisions, because it's the surprise decisions that, take us by surprise. And the worst thing about surprise decisions is the time frame. It's just too short. Time gets compressed and we don't feel like we've got enough information to make our decision. Hopefully you'll find today's question super helpful. But let's look at the first 2 questions briefly before we move on. Judith looked at the first question, am I being honest with myself? Really? It's such a great question because we're all experts at self-deception. We talk ourselves into things that we should know better to talk ourselves into, and we talk ourselves out of other things that we should be into. So every time you have a big decision to make, stop and ask, am I being honest with myself? Really? And question 2 that David looked at last week was, what story do I want to tell? Every decision you make becomes a permanent part of the story of our lives. So when you're making a decision, pause and ask the question, when I look back on this decision, which of my options will I want to be the permanent part of my story? And so today we're looking at our 3rd question. Is there a tension that deserves my attention? Sometimes an option seems uncomfortable. It creates a tension inside of us. Something doesn't seem exactly right. It gives us pause, it bothers us, it causes us to hesitate. It's a red flag moment. That internal sense, this just isn't right. And that's what I mean by a tension. And when that happens, we've got the opportunity to pause and pay attention to the tension. Pause and ask, what is it that's bothering me? Don't ignore it, pay attention to the tension. Some of you might be thinking, that sounds a bit fluffy. I don't base my decisions on emotions. I look at the fact and then I decide. This whole tension thing seems a bit too touchy-feely. But science tells us when we have these red flag moments, it's a specific part of our brain alerting us to pay attention. And so we need to pause so that we stand a better chance of making a better decision. Do I need to pay attention to the tension? Needs to be one of the questions for making better decisions. As we consider our options, if there's a red flag, if there's a tension, we need to pause and allow that feeling, that tension to rise up and get as big as it needs to get before we decide. We need to embrace it, not excuse it. We need to face the tension until it goes away or we decide to go in a different direction. Now there's a fascinating illustration of this principle in the Old Testament. And if you're not a church person, don't worry, I'm not asking you to believe the whole Bible all in one go. I just want to share this one account that illustrates this important principle so well, so don't tune me out. This account involves King David, Israel's second king. Now David stepped onto the history books as a shepherd boy, and he went on to write Psalm 23, the Lord's my shepherd, I shall not want. But when he was a kid, the prophet Samuel showed up at his house and announced to David's family that God had chosen their youngest son to be the next king of Israel. Now that's a great day, but the problem was that Israel already had a king, King Saul. But at the time, King Saul wasn't doing a very good job of being king, so God decided to replace him with David, not with Saul's own son. Anyway, David grew up and became a soldier in Saul's army, and his popularity also grew to the extent that it overshadowed the king's popularity. And Saul became jealous, so jealous of David that he tried on more than one occasion to kill him. So David fled the city and became a fugitive. But by that time, David was such a hero that when he fled, dozens, in fact hundreds, of men flocked to his side, so that he ended up with a small army of his own. And I'd love for you to read the whole account as it's recorded by the prophet Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 24. But here's a brief outline. Saul was told that David and his bunch of merry men were out hiding in the desert. So Saul took 3,000 men and set off to look for David and his men. And in the middle of the search, King Saul had to go to the bathroom. Now, everyone else would have just had to deal with it. But when you're the king, you get to stop the whole parade so that you can go and take care of business in private. So Saul headed off to find a nice, dark, cool bathroom cave. However, the very cave that Saul randomly chose for his pit stop was the same random cave that David and some of his men were hiding in. What are the odds? Imagine what would have been running through David's mind at that point. This must be a sign from God, right? He was delivering David's enemy right into his hands. What else could it mean? David had been anointed as king. The only thing standing in his way was King Saul, and here he was, vulnerable and as unguarded as any king was ever going to be. And if David wasn't thinking those thoughts, then his men were, because they said to him, David, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. So imagine the tension, the pressure David would have felt to act, yes, to become king, but also to save his men from another season of hiding and being separated from their families and risking their lives day after day. But David felt something else as well. He felt a tension. Something wasn't right. And as David got closer to Saul, the tension built. But David must have paid attention to the tension, because somewhere between his hiding place at the back of the cave and Saul's unprotected back, and an action that everybody would have applauded and supported, he gained clarity about the tension he was feeling. It was like, wait a minute, I am about to murder the king. This can't be right. And anyway, who put Saul on the throne in the first place? You see, it's not smart to replace what God has put in place. David knew it wasn't right. This couldn't be God's plan for him. David wouldn't kill the king even if the king was trying to kill him. So David changes course. And remember, we always have a choice. But, and this is what we have in common with David. David couldn't have known the outcome of his decision to kill or not kill the king. There was no guarantee that things would work out. So please don't miss this. The reason we ignore the tension so often is we believe that we can predict outcomes. We think we know what's going to happen, but we don't. We can't always predict outcomes accurately. None of us can. And this is what I know. Have you ever been disappointed after you've made a decision? Yes, of course, because disappointment is always connected with an unexpected outcome. We make a decision, we assume an outcome, the outcome doesn't happen, and then we feel disappointed. Ignoring that tension sets us up for disappointment, but paying attention to the tension is how to avoid unnecessary disappointment. Now, David paid attention to the tension, and he maybe thought, just because I kill the king, that doesn't mean I'll become king, but for certain I will be the man who killed the king. That will be my legacy. That will be the story I have to tell my children and my grandchildren. Can you imagine? "Oh, Grandpa David, tell us about how you became king, the story of how you snuck up on King Saul while he was on the toilet and stabbed him in the back. You were so brave." That wasn't the story that David wanted to tell. So David does something very few people have the self-control to do. He crept up behind Saul, cut the corner off his robe, and went back to his hiding place. His men couldn't believe it. The expressions on their face must have said it all, because here's what David says to them. "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing against my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." In other words, who am I to replace what God has put in place? So Saul leaves the cave, rejoins his men, gets back on his mule, having no idea how close he's come to never leaving the cave when David steps out of that same cave. Talk about drama. There stands the very man that they've been hunting. And the text says that David actually bowed down to King Saul, and then he stands up and he holds up the corner of Saul's robe. And he says, although he could have easily killed the king, he chose not to. And he concludes this short speech, please read it, with these powerful, powerful words. A statement that we should all take to heart. David says, "May the Lord judge between you and me." In other words, I am going to let God determine the outcome. This might be the worst political, military, this might be the worst leadership decision I've ever made. I might forfeit my life, but I will not take matters into my own hand. I will not replace what God's put in place. I'm not going to play God in your life, and I'm not going to play God in my life. Paying attention to the tension is important for everyone. But for those of us who believe in a loving, personal, relational God, that seemingly irrational tension can be God's way of redirecting us in a different direction. People whose lives are totally yielded to God don't play God. They don't try to predict outcomes. Instead, they surrender, they obey, and they follow. David surrendered to God, and not too long after, King Saul and his army were in a big battle, and a random enemy archer launched an arrow that randomly fell amongst the Israelite army. But this random arrow found a seam in Saul's armour, and it mortally wounded him. And Saul didn't want to be killed by the enemy, so he fell on his own sword and he died. And when word reached the city that Saul was dead, David was proclaimed king. Who knows, perhaps David thought, well, if someone had told me that this is how it was going to work out, that would have made that whole cave thing a lot easier. But that's not how life works, is it? And that's why we have to pay attention to the tension, not to take matters into our own hands, not to trust our ability or our inability to predict the future. So every time you make a decision, especially a decision that takes you by surprise, ask yourself, is there a tension that deserves my attention? Don't ignore it. Don't brush by it. Let it bother you until you know why it's bothering you. This might be God's way of protecting you, his way of keeping you from making a decision that you might live to regret. So as we conclude, let me say it one more time. Pay attention to the tension. And would you join us next week when Judith will be looking at the last question that will help us make better decisions?
Hello.
Hello everybody, back in the workshop again this week.
Hello and welcome.
I hope you've had a good week.
Hello and welcome to Turning Point Church. Thank you so much for joining us today.
If you'd like to find out more, please contact us via the website, Instagram or Facebook.